on the way to abolition, like what that looks like. But I'm going to hand this over to Doug to moderate going forward until just before 4, when we will break just for announcements. Okay, Doug, if you would. Thanks.
Hi, thank you. I was just planning to ask questions for about 15 minutes or so and then turn it over to a general discussion, because who wants to listen to me for too long? Welcome, Alex. Thanks for doing this.
You bet.
You're a busy guy these days, I'm sure. Much in demand. So how'd you get into this line of work, studying cops?
Yeah, great question to start with. So very unintentionally. I had studied in college things like urban economic development, housing policy, looking at community development corporations, urban enterprise zones, things like that. And then I managed to, after some volunteering and interning, got a job at the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness doing housing policy. I sat on a county task force that was putting together the city and county's what was called a CHAS then, Community Housing Assessment Survey, something like that. It's been a while, 30 years. And I thought that's kind of what I was going to do for a while, but it was at this period in the early 90s that we began to see this big uptick in police harassment of homeless folks. And my boss asked me to look into it. We had a person who did some civil rights stuff, but they had left, and so I was the only one in the office who'd like been arrested, had been through the court system, had been in a jail. So he's like, well, you know something about this, so go ask around. And it turned out that, this was the beginning of broken windows policing. And I realized pretty quickly what was happening was that the city had given up on actually housing people and had turned the problem over to the police to manage. And then I eventually decided to go back to school in '93 to graduate school in New York, right as Giuliani gets elected. And the same thing is happening all over again. And I get pulled into work with some groups in New York who knew about the work I'd done in California. And there were a lot more jobs in academia for criminologists than there were for urbanists. And I kind of remade myself into an urban police scholar. And that's really how I got launched in this.
The title of the book, End of Policing, it can have a double meaning, to me at least, as an aim or termination. Did you intend that to be ambiguous, or what did you mean?
Also, in the sense of, do you mean like ends and means in that sense?
Yes.
Yeah, so yes, that was on my mind. I mean, Verso wanted to just call it Abolish the Police. And I didn't really want to say that because I didn't feel like...
The word abolish or abolition doesn't appear in the book at all. I searched.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Yeah. So I was certainly influenced by the prison abolition movement. I mean, I was a very early part of critical resistance. Rose Braz, one of the founders, and I went back over 30 years. I knew Ruthie back in the 90s. Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, was teaching all that stuff at Brooklyn College 20 years ago. And I felt like no one was really talking about policing. Everything was about mass incarceration and prison abolition. And I thought, well, let's try to stage an intervention that brings policing into the conversation. But I decided to try to do it in a way that would be potentially accessible to a very broad audience. I knew I had written academic books, I had tenure, I said, let's see if I can write something that will be like the policing version of the new Jim Crow. It's kind of what I was thinking, because she doesn't use the word abolition either, even though I know today she does consider herself an abolitionist. I'm not sure she did then. And I just thought it would signaling, this is a long-winded answer to, yes, the two meanings. Signaling we'd like to get to some place where we don't have police, but also this is about thinking about what is the purpose of police? What are the ends of policing? What is this really about?
And have you changed your thinking in any major way since this book appeared? It's been 3 years or so. Anything changed?
No, I mean, we're working on a second edition, and I've been thinking like what to add. And I know one area that there was a lot of back and forth on at the time that we were finishing it up was whether or not to have a chapter about domestic violence and or violence against women. And I kind of wanted to, but I felt like there was not kind of enough other work out there to draw upon. There was Beth Ritchie's amazing book, Arrested Justice, but not a whole lot of other scholarship case studies that I felt could help me really make the case. Today, I could. There's a great new book, Decriminalizing Domestic Violence by Lee Goodmark at University of Maryland Law School. Aya Gruber's new book on carceral feminism, Victoria Law's work on carceral feminism. So I think that's one area where I wish I had been, prescient enough to really force the issue and try to get a chapter in about that.
Over the last month or so, we've seen a surge in shootings in New York City and other cities across the country. The cops are blaming jail releases, bail reform, people being mean to them, not appreciating their important work. What's your explanation of what's going on?
I don't really know. I mean, the first thing to point out is that shootings have gone up in a variety of cities, and in each city, the police say it's because of some very specific dynamic to this city that we don't like. Right, so there was no bail reform in Baltimore, but shootings are going up there. Right? So, and this was the same thing with the crime drop, right? Every local police department wanted to say the crime drop was because of something they uniquely did, and the crime drop was a broad international phenomena that has been going on for decades. So, it's possible that this has something to do with grievances that built up over the quarantine period that now are kind of spilling out as people go outside more. It could be that the anxiety and social frustration about the economy, about the disproportionate health impacts on Black communities, just a sense of rage that's percolating. And I think we can see this with like the fireworks thing too, right? That young people are just expressing a lot of anger. So we don't know exactly what's causing it. It's not bail reform. Even the New York Post recently released a study, I think last Monday or something.
I was shocked to see that in the Post. It was amazing.
Yeah, well, I think they were hoping to get a different result, but they showed, look, this is not connected. These shootings, because crime is still going down overall. It's just that there's been this uptick in shootings, and the shootings are not tied to bail reform. Bail reform, you would expect to be tied to like an increase in burglaries and car break-ins and petty things, because that's who's in the jail on bail, but those crimes are still going down.
In your passage about crowd control, you said, this is a highly managed system not characterized by uncoordinated uses of force or police riots as seen in the 60s, when police supervisors were seen chasing after officers to try to keep them from beating protesters in the street. In the last month or two, we've seen a lot of beating going on. What's happened? What's changed? I mean, is it reverting to the old ways? Is this, the cops are taking this far more personally since so much of the protest is directed at them? What do you see going on here?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we're seeing a broad counter-protest being staged by rank-and-file police. Some of it is organized, the decisions to deploy police in certain ways. But when we see all these images of individual officers like shooting journalists with pepper balls or stuff, that was not the game plan they got that morning from the commander in charge that day. This is officers going off and wreaking vengeance on people. And I think, so we call this type of policing escalated force policing, as opposed to, let's say, a model of negotiated management, which is what a lot of us have seen over the last few decades. And it's a lot easier to have a low intensity, more tolerant negotiated management form of policing when the protests don't present any kind of real threat to the established order. But the protests today represent a kind of existential threat to policing. And even the police don't believe that these reforms that have been bandied about the last 5-6 years are going to get them out of this mess. And so they've just reverted to type. They're like, well, then we're just going to battle it out on the streets.
And my final question, you suggest throughout the book, you suggest serious reforms, not bullshit reforms like body cameras, but, you know, serious reforms of how policing is accomplished, changes in legislation, but you also acknowledge that a really major social overhaul would be necessary to reduce our need for police, but you stop short of full abolition. What's your thinking on that? Like I said, the word doesn't even appear. You alluded to this, but could you go into some detail in your thinking about abolishing the police?
Yeah, and I'm not interested in undercutting or hedging on what abolitionists are saying. I was just trying to articulate a process and a kind of game plan for moving forward that might end up in the same place. But my feeling is that ultimately, in a complex society, you're going to have some kind of violence workers. Now, we want to make that as limited as possible, and we want to constrain that use of force as much as possible. But I personally can't quite see what that future without any violence workers looks like. But I think it doesn't look anything like what we have now. I certainly don't want it to look anything like what we have now. So what I usually say is, look, the vast majority of what police do has nothing to do with that. They're not chasing bank robbers. They're not catching serial killers. They're not stopping home invasions. They're harassing homeless people and young people in the park after dark and people with low-level drug problems and street-level sex workers and dealing with noise complaints and taking burglary reports that will never even get investigated, much less solved, and that almost all of that we can just do away with. But I felt like if I opened with abolition, and I should just point out that the title, the deal for the book was before Ferguson, before Eric Garner. And I had none of us had any idea we were getting ready to have this massive ongoing movement. And I just felt like the concept abolition was so pigeonholed in a narrow area of discourse that I didn't want to limit the audience to these ideas, just people who were already self-consciously thinking of themselves as abolitionists.
Has your position changed on this over the last few years?
No, I think, I'm surprised you didn't sort of lead with this question. So, like, one of the left criticisms of the book is that it's not sufficiently anti-capitalist, and that it doesn't tell us how to get to abolition. Which I don't think the latter is really a reasonable critique, but I think the first one maybe needs to be addressed a little bit. And what I say pretty consistently is that policing is a tool to facilitate regimes of exploitation. And those regimes of exploitation are not limited to capitalism, but obviously capitalism in its various forms is at the center of this. In the 19th century, it was things like slavery, colonialism, and the management and formation of a stable industrial working class. Today, it takes the form of a kind of neoliberal capitalism where we have this massive group of people who are basically disconnected from the global economy and are left in tremendous economic precarity, and that's what police does. Puts a lid on mass homelessness and black markets and untreated mental health and substance abuse problems. And so my thinking hasn't changed on this. I think that we need to work towards reducing our reliance on policing in every way possible. And part of that has to include an analysis of the political and economic arrangements that rely on policing to permit those systems to move forward.
All right, that's the end of what I prepared. So if anyone else wants to jump in, either what they read in the book or extending the earlier discussion or reacting to anything that Alex said. Carrington, do you want to handle the stack or should I do that?
Happy to go either way. If it's easy for you to do, that's fine.
Well, I just said they're scrolling by here. Okay, Rachel, start with.
Hi, thanks Alex for taking the time to join us. I have a question about kind of like this really recent Occupy City Hall, and I was curious if you have any thoughts on that, things that they did well, things they could have done better, kind of that one specific action within the larger narrative of end of policing.
So I was not there in person. I am with my extended family in Massachusetts. So, and have been for about 4 months now. So just so people know that. So one of the major players in putting that together was Vocal New York, that works with folks who have been drug involved or are drug involved, who rely on a harm reduction strategy and do a tremendous amount of grassroots organizing in communities that have historically been passed over, overlooked, an incredibly vulnerable population. And they've had tremendous success in creating a grassroots organization. So I'm a huge fan of theirs and have been a big supporter of theirs for many years and am active in their civil rights group. So I thought it was a very good emergency strategy given the protests that were happening and the immediacy of the budget decision-making process. I thought I couldn't think of too many other grassroots mobilization interventions that could have been staged more effectively than this. The only one I can think of would have been to have 20 occupations at 20 different city council offices simultaneously. That would have been great too. And there were protests. There were decentralized protests as well, but I thought it was tremendous. The question is this a sustainable long-range strategy? I think things like this should be an expression of a movement, not the focus of a movement. My feeling strategically is that now that the budget's resolved, we need to go back to the work of convincing our neighbors that we have a better vision for producing healthy, safe, and just communities, and that policing is an impediment to accomplishing that. And that means we've got to talk to them about why the communities look the way they do, what the forces are that impede those communities, and what we could do instead of policing.
All right, DJ.
Hi, thanks for taking the time. In the book, you talk a lot about the unconstitutionality of different police tactics. Is there like a body of legislative challenges to the constitutionality of those tactics that you can talk about? And do you think there's a role in whether it's the sort of structural reform or abolition, do you think there's a role of like, legal challenges and maybe Supreme Court cases and stuff like that in this, or should we be focusing on other things?
Right. So I don't think I say that a lot. I think I say it in a couple of targeted places, like thinking about homelessness, for instance. So to me, this is a strategic question. And I look to certain tactics in the civil rights movement historically. So like the We Charge Genocide movement that tried to frame what was happening to African Americans in terms of policing as a broad kind of human rights and anti-constitutional approach. And I think in the case of homeless policing, it's just so obvious, criminalization of homelessness. But I don't think we should be spending our time primarily trying to find legal challenges. And I think, especially given the constitution of the court as currently populated, I think that's a very limited strategy. It can only be used when the violations are obvious in existing case law. That we're not going to get any new good case law, I don't think, in the foreseeable future. So, I mean, these are political questions that have to be resolved through political mobilization, which is some combination of electoral and street level pressure.
The stack is empty. Anyone else?
That's it. Okay, well, it was nice talking.
Okay, there's Jeremy just leapt in.
Hi, Alex. Thanks so much for joining us. I guess a question that came up kind of frequently in our discussions, and it's one I've thought about a lot with regards to kind of the movement coalescing around the defund demand is kind of the question of like the cost of policing versus the cost of, as you were putting it, sort of an actual vision of a real healthy society that socialists are trying to build. So you point out at times studies that suggest that policing is perhaps a very costly way of addressing social problems. And I guess I am just sort of automatically skeptical about that, because I think that capitalists have been pretty pro cutting the state whenever possible. And it seems to me, like, for instance, you point this out with homelessness in the book. And it seems to me that if a left solution to homelessness, which would be building some sort of housing guarantee and housing the poor, it's true that maybe for particular homeless people that are picked up by cops, it might be overall cheaper to provide them with homes, but you wouldn't just have to provide them with homes. You would be restructuring a society that would require actually a lot more resources, ideally from the rich. So I guess I'm just sort of thinking about, is it really like, is it really less costly?
Yeah.
And how do we frame kind of conversations around, most other states that have better societies than we do spend a hell of a lot more money on social welfare, even than we spend on our cops?
Yeah. So I try to mobilize that argument pretty sparingly and strategically. And you'll see in the conclusion, for instance, of the book, there's no real focus on, oh, well, what I'm proposing is going to save us money. Because I don't think that that's the overall plan. I've said since the book came out, pretty consistently, that it's going to take more than cannibalizing the police budget to fix these problems. So there are part of the challenge here, right, is that we've got to build movements. We've got to build momentum. And that means that you've got to develop campaigns that are coherent, that people can see the utility of and are ready to move forward on. And so sometimes the leading edge, the tip of the spear, can be picking off a piece of the puzzle where we can make a costing argument. In other cases, while articulating a bigger vision, right? So we could manage certain parts of this problem cheaper while we work on these bigger restructuring things. But I certainly agree that the central theme of this movement should not be that it's cheaper. It should be that it's more just and more effective. And that it's trying to get us somewhere even better. Can I just say one other thing on costing? It doesn't look like a huge long stack. So where I thought you were going at first was that you're often told that, well, we found a study that some economists did that said that if we flood 3 blocks with 1,000 police, we'll save 2 lives, and that every life is worth $10 million according to these econometric forecast modelings, whatever, and therefore policing is incredibly cost effective, and we should be hiring more police all the time. So what I say is that what those things never calculate is a full costing of relying on police-centered strategies. It goes beyond just the cost of hiring officers. So because first of all, there is a big cost in hiring those officers, and there is a lot we could do with $3 billion a year, cutting the police, and really cutting the police budget in half is more like $5 billion a year when you take in the pensions and the health care. There's a lot we could do with $5 billion to make New York City not just safer, but a more just place. But also, there's an that includes within it, there's an opportunity cost, which is how could we produce that safety better with that $5 billion? So it's not just that we would have money to give more tax breaks, it's that money could be used more effectively. But finally, there's an ideological cost. Right? Every time we buy into, financially, rhetorically, this idea that police are the solution to our problems, we undercut ideologically the argument that says, no, the solution to our problems is robust interventions in housing and labor markets. Right? So that any politician who agrees to hire more police or increase police spending or anything like that is working at cross purposes to everything else we're trying to do. Because that investment in policing comes with an ideology that says that the reason we have problems is because of moral insufficiency, right? Individual and group moral failure that will only respond to punitive interventions. And once we enable that ideology in any way, we're working directly against everything else that we stand.
All right, I believe Justin was next.
Thanks for joining us, Alex.
Justin.
My question is about, you get a lot of gotcha questions when you talk about, defunding and abolition, but I think one that is worth thinking about that isn't necessarily always a gotcha is what happens to cops after we, radically defund their departments or abolish them. I mean, like, I know they're not all cops are reactionaries, but there's a good number of them in there. Where do they go? What do they do? So just kind of wondering what you think about that.
So the short answer to that is that the proposals that I've personally been involved with putting forward call for attrition, not layoffs. But even if we did go for layoffs, keep in mind, most of the most conservative members of the department do not live in the city. They live on Long Island and other far-flung places, right? So they're not going to be forming right-wing paramilitary units in the Bronx. They're going to be expressing their anger in white suburbs and white rural places, which is not to say that it doesn't mean anything or we should be unconcerned, but it is not not my immediate concern. But the other thing is that, look, my sense is that the majority of young people, by far the majority of young people going into policing in New York and most other big city police departments would be very happy taking other kinds of jobs. I did an event down in Houston a while back, and some Black and Latino officers came, and they were older, and some were retired, and they were like, look, we came from over-policed neighborhoods, we hated it, but we thought maybe we'll go into policing and change the culture of policing and help people through policing. And they said it was a total failure. We were hoping you could tell us how to change the culture of policing. And I was like, there's no changing the culture of policing. That's a non-starter. But I said, look, listen to this. They were still trying to figure out, so then what are you saying? And I said, listen to this. When you decided to become a police officer, if there had been a job for the same pay and benefits, working in a community center in your own neighborhood, teaching football, this is Texas, right? Coaching football and mentoring kids, which job would you have chosen? And they all laughed and they said, oh man, we would have loved to have worked with kids in the neighborhood and coach football and mentor kids, but there were no such jobs. And I'm like, exactly. Why are there never those jobs? And the police department is always hiring. The same thing for the corrections union. I wrote a piece for the Daily News about this, calling out the corrections union. Their own members hate working at Rikers Island. Why die on your sword to keep Rikers going? Why don't you instead do job transfers at the same pay and benefits, working in libraries and community centers, no commute, no having to put up with the toxic conditions at Rikers, environmental, social, behavioral, whatever. So there's a longer story there, but I'll leave it. But yes, job transfers, better jobs for people, and the worst of the worst don't even live in the city, and I don't really care what happens.
Carrington.
Hi, yeah, thanks again, Alex, for joining us. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on strategies DSA could use to address many of the issues you bring up in your book, like if there are areas that are maybe more vulnerable. I know one thing we're doing is, you know, we hope to get some city council members in New York City in 2021, and we're looking for people who are not accepting money from police unions. That's something I think we've got that one down, but I'm wondering if you have other ideas about maybe like immigrant detention centers, demilitarizing the police. I work with the International Committee in DSA, and that would be like an area maybe we could do things like on migration, justice, and you know, foreign policy issues. But if you have ideas locally too,
Yeah.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so full disclosure, I've been working with Bianca and other folks on the platform for the city council races. So the language about, you know, defunding police and redirecting resources, that I did the initial draft on that stuff. So I think that this is terribly important, not just that we have this position around the electoral campaign, I think we should, but we should actually be advocating programmatically for these budget transformations. And the way to do that is what I signaled earlier, right? Is that we've got to work in our own communities. North Brooklyn, I'm in the Central Brooklyn chapter, and we've got to convince our neighbors in all kinds of neighborhoods that policing is not the solution to all our problems, and that here's what a better alternative would look like. And that is not going to look the same in every neighborhood, because the public safety dynamics and challenges and politics are not the same in every neighborhood. So where I live, gang violence is not really a big problem. It's fear of outsiders, it's mass homelessness, it's, you know, car break-ins, whatever. But whatever it is, I think we've got to go out and talk to people about what that is, build partnerships with other organizations, and say, no, we need to decriminalize sex work, get police out of the drug business, create concrete alternatives to using the police on mental health calls, right? Monty Williams has a great plan for doing this. He and I are doing an event together next week, week after next, with the National Alliance of the Mentally Ill, to say, look, we got to just get the police completely out of the mental health business. The NYPD goes on almost 200,000 EDP calls every year. It's a massive amount of what they do, and it's almost entirely counterproductive. So I think there are lots of very concrete campaigns we could get involved in. You know, the sex work campaign is up and running. Some parts of DSA have been supporting it. Get the police out of the schools is another active campaign. Replace police with mental health crisis response. That's a third one, very concrete. People could be plugging into. Justin and I have been talking about some of these things for the last year, and about how to get people in DSA kind of to focus in on 2 or 3 of these kind of across working groups and across branches.
Do you see any chance we'd have with demilitarizing police, or drawing more attention to the militarization of police?
Well, it depends on what you mean by that. I mean, I think that it's a little tough in New York politically, because New York is one of the places that's going to be hard to say there's no terrorism threat. There's absolutely no reason why you should need an armored vehicle. I think to go and say that in Omaha or Ames, Iowa, or something like that, where there's a massive amount of this equipment, is a lot easier to do. For me, one of the keys to demilitarization and disarming the police is to just dramatically reduce the number of police and the scope of their operations. If we just get the police out of the drug business, that's going to demilitarize the police. Because a huge amount of what these militarized units do is serve drug warrants, go after the drug gangs. And so we just need to put a stop to that. I think that's a better way to go about it than trying to take their toys away. I mean, on the surveillance front, I think there's more we could do. So there's the STOP group and the Brennan Center that were part of this coalition behind the Post Act that recently passed, but the Post Act is completely insufficient. It's kind of an opening salvo. And so they've got additional plans for stopping this rolling out of more and more surveillance technology. So I think maybe that would be more fruitful.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay, I'm going to call on myself. Cop unions. It's hard for socialists to be anti-unions, but cop unions are pretty vile in a lot of ways. So how should we think about it? What should we do with them?
Yeah, so I'm a fourth generation unionist and just finished a long term as a vice president of my union. So I think that it's definitely not a good idea to be in the business of breaking unions, because that will just come back and bite us in the ass in all kinds of ways, right? Because then we'll be making common cause with the folks who are against all public sector unions, for instance. So I think what we have to do is what Carrington referred to, right? Which is we've got to get the political interventions of the police unions to be seen as toxic, so that no politician wants to touch them. Eric Adams is getting a huge amount of cop money, not so much from the mainstream unions, but from some of the Black and Latino cops. But in my mind, that's not really that much better. That's about reforming the police and hiring more Black police chiefs. And so I think any politician who's taking cop union money should be canceled. There it is. I said it. They should be canceled.
I feel an open letter coming in. But what about, they also cover for bad cops. How do we deal with that?
Dramatically reduce the size of the police force. Take away as many of their responsibilities. I just don't think there's a lot we can do about that through the existing mechanisms, because if the politicians tell the police to go out and wage a war against the public, then they're going to cover for cops who do bad things, or they're going to throw them under the bus as individuals. And we just don't see any of these accountability measures, even when implemented, feeding back into better policing. So I think, yes, obviously the police play a caustic role. I mean, I think it's fine to try to intervene in the collective bargaining process, to bring pressure on politicians to not sign these sweetheart deals about shielding them from accountability. But how do you do that? By getting rid of the politicians who take cop money, right? So it's the same strategy. If you look at the budget vote, right, there was a breakdown. If you look at the budget vote, the 9 members who voted against the budget had almost no money from cop unions. And the people who voted for the budget had like an average of, what was it, like $37,000 from cop unions attributed to that. So yeah, we've got every single one of those people who voted for the budget has to be called out for taking that cop money.
Make it as radioactive as real estate money.
Exactly, exactly.
Rachel, I think, is next.
Can I actually hand it to Emily, since I've talked a couple times?
Okay, sure. Emily?
Got caught off guard.
Can't hear you, Emily.
She's muted. No, she was talking about, I didn't hear you, Emily. I still don't hear you.
Yeah, nothing.
Why don't you put something in the chat and we'll try to take a look at it. Who's next, Doug?
Well, there we go.
Oh, there it is. There it is. What is your reaction to the dynamics of how defund and abolition conversations playing out in the public sphere, social media about these topics? Anything surprising, troubling, encouraging? Okay, so, just like I didn't really use abolition language, defund the police was not really part of my repertoire either. It was something that could fit on a cardboard sign or a Twitter hashtag. It wasn't really the language that people who were doing this work on the ground were using for the most part. So it's been a lot of work to try to educate people what it means. So obviously the far right thin blue line folks actively misrepresented what it meant, but there was a lot of genuine confusion, uncertainty about what it meant. Now, there's been actually some polling data lately that shows people are hearing what we're saying. They're getting the message. They understand now that it's not tomorrow we flip some switch and there are no police. This is about switching priorities and shifting resources. And when people understand it, the approvals are pretty high, higher than I would have expected in some cases. So I think we just have to keep explaining it to people. And now that the immediacy of like budget fights are kind of over for the most part, we can go back to building up the community organizing that's been going on. I mean, you know, I've been going to 20, 25 cities a year supporting this work for the last 3 years. So this organizing is happening and we just need to keep building it.
Okay, this time is getting a little short, so now we're going to go back to Rachel.
Hi. So I guess one of my questions is actually very much on that same topic. I've seen a lot of discourse around the phrase jail killer cops. And maybe your answer responds to this as well. But I think for me, this has felt like a more convoluted one because I've heard a lot more on both ends of the discussion about this, like a very, very loud group saying, you know, very repeatedly, arrest Breonna Taylor's killers, jail killer cops, and then another group that's like, no, that actually undercuts like us trying to disrupt the system, and then that group coming back, and all these back and forths that I think has been really interesting. And that's my first question. And then I have a second question, but I'll wait till after you respond to that one maybe.
Okay, so great. I'm gonna just channel my buddy Derica Purnell for a minute. She wrote a lovely piece in The Guardian a while back about this. She grew up in St. Louis in a heavily over-policed community and was part of the Ferguson uprising and was out there with most other folks talking about jailing killer cops, you know, and that's how we're going to fix racist policing. But one of the things about what's happened is that, you know, the history of police brutality movements was that they were incredibly episodic and short-lived. And as a result, there wasn't very much deepening of analysis. But this has been sustained long enough that that's why I think we've switched from body cameras, community policing, jail killer cops to defund the police, police abolition. So Derica says, look, we wanted justice in the language of what we had been told justice was, which was punishment, retribution. But if we're ever going to get out of mass incarceration and abusive policing, we have to reject that vision of justice. And it's a dead end. The master's tools are not going to give us the justice we want. They weren't designed to do that. Mariam Kava's been very good on this question too. It's written along these lines. So it's just, it's easy to understand the appeal of it, but it's a dead end strategy. And it is a live question. I mean, that's one of the hardest things in doing what I do is like being on a panel with the mom of someone who's been killed by police, whose total analysis is jail those killer cops, and trying to say, that's not going to get you what you think it's going to get you. It's just not. And it's very hard to have that conversation with folks sometimes, but I think it's getting easier all the time. So Derica wrote her thing up in The Guardian. So she's written a lot of things for The Guardian, but if you put Derica Purnell and jail killer cops, you'll find her essay. Maybe you could put it in the chat for us. Somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think my second question you kind of led into, because I think another piece that I've had a lot of trouble reconciling with is thinking about restorative justice as a model as an alternative to policing and punitive justice. And then thinking about, well, what if the harmed then asks for what you were saying, the jail killer cops narrative? But I would love to hear more broadly also how you think of restorative justice within your work and kind of how that, like all of that.
I'm looking to see some of my books or somewhere else. Okay, so restorative justice has a form that we commonly see it in, like in school settings, that is very limited. The scope of its operation, it tends to be for small things, and it tends to involve alternative penalties or talking things out, but it's not able to tap into structural dynamics in a meaningful way. So it's a micro level strategy for resolving conflicts. What we need is a macro level strategy. Now, some people have said that, well, restorative justice has always included that capacity, just hasn't been implemented. Other people have tried out language around transformative justice to try to capture that tension. If you look carefully, there's nothing in transformative justice that doesn't exist in the theories around restorative justice. It's just a way of signaling we're not talking about something that's attached to a community court or a school district. We want something that can bring in these structural ideas. So what would that look like? So let's just stick with the school setting for a second. So most of the disciplinary problems in schools don't start in the school. They come in the front door with the kids. They're about problems at home, problems in the community. Now, and sometimes they're problems with the school. So let's say a student is acting out because they're in a really bad dynamic with a particular teacher. Well, the solution to that is not more counseling for the student, it's to get a different teacher for that student. So, but to do that, you have to have structural power within the institution to get a kid shifted into a different classroom, or to have some intervention with that teacher. If the problem's in the community, is this a problem of abuse in the home, of inadequate nutrition, of an undiagnosed learning disability? Like, is it about violence in the community, bullying? Or we need to be able to reach into these other sectors with some resources to be able to start figuring out why kids are not invested in their education, or why they're being disruptive behaviorally because of these bigger problems. And this is true for, problems in communities too. We need a system that can feed back into these structural dynamics. Housing insecurity, labor market insecurity, family supports, whatever it is.
All right, I'm going to ask a question. Well, hopefully the stack will replenish itself.
I want to hear from Lee, who was talking when I came in, who was mobilizing a really important critique. So I'd like to talk about that some.
Budgeting?
But go ahead, ask your question.
Okay, yeah, let's get Lee back after I ask my question. This is a question I asked when I interviewed the radio. New York City is very heavily policed. Number of cops per capita is at the very high end of big cities. And we have a lot of big cities like San Diego, I believe, have per capita cop ratios that are like half ours or less. What difference does the fact that we're very heavily policed make? Or what would it look like? How might New York City be different if we were more like San Diego?
Yeah, I got a little grief from I talked about the fact that LA has about half the capita number of police work. And this was on an interview I did on New York One. And some folks in LA gave me a little bit of a hard time because they felt like I was holding up LA as like, well, see, we should just do what LA does. But of course, policing in LA is also terrible, just terrible in a different way. So I wasn't meaning to say that, yes, we should just look like LA. I was meaning to say that with even half the number of police, civilization will not collapse. That LA doesn't have dramatically different crime rates or whatever. So, but the LAPD, because of its lower per capita number of police and much broader geography, has relied on a lot of one-person cars. That saves a lot of money. The unions have fought to the death to maintain 2 officers per car because it makes it more interesting to do the job to have a partner. That's what I think. They say it's about officer safety, but really it's just really a lot more boring if you're in the car by yourself. The officers hate it. But also they rely on even more preemptive violence, I think, than like because they're often by themselves, longer backup times, so they feel even more need to immediately take charge of a situation than the NYPD does. In New York, they can just throw cops at problems. And I actually think the cops in New York are not that well trained or that sophisticated. They're not given the same level of independence and responsibility that cops, for instance, out west are in California. If you notice, like, think back to the Occupy protests and the protest cycle we've just been in, look at how many of the arrests are being, and forceful interventions are carried out by white shirts. These are supervisors. That's because they don't trust the line officers. They feel like they have to be directly the ones making the arrest, otherwise the situation will go even worse.
Leo's disappeared, it seems, but let me just bring his question back. He seemed to think that fighting over budgeting and defunding is, I don't know, kind of boring and reformist and takes us off from the wrong track. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, I don't think that's an unreasonable position to start with. I mean, there's a question about if that's really what's being talked about here. If it's really just a budget fight, I think there is a limit to it. But I also wouldn't discount budget fights, right? I think, Doug, you maybe put something in the chat that said, you know, this lays bare how government really works. And they would prefer to obscure all of that so that they can do their little real estate deals and little insider trading gigs, right? Where they get campaign money to subsidize XYZ or to give a contract to certain people. So I do think it's important, but it's not the be all and end all, right? I mean, we need direct interventions in housing markets and labor markets, and not all of that is going to get expressed through budget battles. And we got to build, we also have to be careful that we don't fall into the kind of insider lobbying, maybe is part of what he was reacting to, is, well, we get groups together and we meet with legislators, and that's what budget lobbying is. We say, oh, thank you so much, and, you know, we put on a suit and tie and played the game. I don't think an occupation outside City Hall is reformist budget lobbying. I think it's a pretty direct attack on everyday politics and existing political arrangements.
Yeah, that quote was Rudolf Goldschmied, early 20th century German sociologist, who said, the budget is the skeleton of the state stripped bare of all misleading ideologies, which is, I think, a nice little aphorism. Okay, yes. DJ, you're back on your stack here.
Yeah, sort of switching topics. Yeah, there's been a lot of sort of discussion in like popular media, and I've been thinking about this a lot around the sort of pop culture sort of representation of police, whether it's like Cops or Live PD, all the way to like Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Like, you know, what is your point of view on that? Is this basically just a sideshow that we should essentially ignore, or do you think it has significant effects on sort of the way that people view police and their willingness to understand and accept like either reform or abolition?
I think it's really important. I was shocked to see that we got rid of Live PD and Cops. I think this is incredibly positive. I give huge credit to the podcast Running from Cops. I don't know if anyone's listened to that. I think that's got to be one of the reasons that we were able to get rid of those shows, is that they really expose just how toxic the politics of these shows are. Now, the nightly dramas are usually not that much better, but they're not nearly as bad. They perpetuate this idea that what police do is catch bank robbers and serial killers, and that they're going around solving whodunits. And of course, this is what a very small number of elite detectives do. Maybe 2% of the police department. And even then, shows like CSI are mostly fantasy. Technology that doesn't really exist, and if it does exist, isn't actually available to police departments beyond the theoretical, And, CSI perpetuates this myth that what police do is they find some little bit of trace evidence. And step by step, this leads them to some wholly unimagined person. When in fact, it's exactly the opposite. Police have someone in custody who they believe did it, and they need the evidence to get that person to plead guilty so they don't have to have a trial. That's how this stuff really works. There's none of this whodunit nonsense. But also a lot of it just perpetuates the worst kind of thin blue line politics. CBS as a network is actually, I think, the worst. Shows like Blue Bloods. It's basically a wholly owned subsidiary of the NYPD.
Jeremy.
Yeah, I guess I have a couple questions about sort of the politics, sort of how socialists try to continually kind of widen the discussions and build kind of support for a larger program. I like in your book, and you've mentioned in the talk too, how, sort of things that socialists kind of think, other things on the program besides our specific criminal justice reforms, like jobs guarantee, housing guarantee, is not sort of incidental to the question of safe societies. It is kind of essential. I do, though, I think at times socialists are confronted with a sort of charge, changing the subject sort of charge. So I wonder how best to thread that needle. So that was one question. And another question around this is, I think one of the kind of political dynamics that was revealed with the Bernie Sanders campaign, and I think is also, we're seeing it play out some in the present too, is how much of a generational divide on some of these issues there are. And specifically around cops, people in the reading group have talked about like their own parents, people whose parents lived in New York, for instance, in the 70s, saying like, what are you, crazy? You want to have less cops? Like, I remember what cities were like not that long ago. And, it's easy for you to say, et cetera. So I wonder if you have thoughts about bridging that generational divide in terms of politics of policing.
I'm sorry, and just remind me the first part again.
How we continue to make the connections between the larger program.
Okay. All right. Yes. So I put something in the chat about this new federal legislation. It hasn't been introduced yet, but it's coming from members of the squad, but really it's coming from the movement for Black Lives, from Patrice Cullors and things like that. And I reference their work in the book where they say things like, police reform is a jobs guarantee or a guaranteed minimum income or a workers' bill of rights. I think that, Medicare for all is a police reform initiative. It's not a distraction. Now, it has to be we have to connect the dots for people. I did a podcast with the Atlantic recently that is their COVID podcast. And they're like, well, so how do we think of this in terms of like public health stuff? And I said, well, look, we've turned the drug problems around drugs over to the police to manage when it's clearly a public health problem. We have no funding for public health interventions. Nobody can get decent medically qualified drug treatment on demand. Look at the mental health policing. This is a medical problem that's been turned over to police to manage. So if we had real medical services, we could dramatically reduce the scope of policing. And between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. So I think these things are directly connected. And also, as I mentioned before in our conversation about costs, right? Police are a direct interference with our ability to articulate a more radical socialist-oriented politics. And they will be used to stop us. They will criminalize our movements, put our people in prison, beat people in the streets to stop us. So anything we can do to reduce their power creates political space for us to do what we need to do. So that's very straightforward. So now, how do we talk to people about safety? So one of the things I think we have to lead with is the idea that this is a public safety movement. if you look at the organizing that's really happening on the ground, it's a movement for public safety led by people who have experienced a profound lack of safety in their lives, and for whom police were not the solution, they were part of the problem. And so this is about articulating a better vision for how to create safe and healthy and just communities. And that includes like solving asthma problems for kids and clean drinking water and thinking about safety and health more broadly than just street violence. But street violence is part of it too. You know, and policing is, I feel, plays a role in perpetuating street violence. 8% of all homicides committed in the United States are committed by police. In some communities, it's as high as 15%. They're part of the violence problem. The American Public Health Association 2 years ago in San Diego passed an organization-wide resolution about police violence that said police violence is a major public health threat in the United States, and the solution to that is to get the police out of our lives in as many ways possible. They adopted an abolitionist platform, entire American Public Health Association.
Who was next here? I believe Emily.
And it was great. I was lucky enough to be there for it and to play some role in supporting it. It was amazing.
Wow.
The groupings that came together around that.
I believe Emily is next. Writing this, I'd be interested to hear more of your thoughts on the role of surveillance tech in U.S. policing. Increasingly, scholars like Benjamin write about fears that even as we defund, budgets are shifting more into surveillance. She calls this the new Jim Code. What trends do you see playing out that are concerning? Beyond the Post-Act, how do you think about reforms and alternatives?
Yeah, I think we should definitely be concerned. I mean, this was always part of the right on crime agenda. This was to, replace bricks and mortars policing with more predictive policing and electronic monitoring, post-arrest, post-conviction, et cetera. So this is a big concern. There is a pretty reasonable national conversation happening about this. There's a movement of folks against electronic monitoring that are publicizing this issue. So predictive policing is about the use of all kinds of algorithms and databases to say, oh, we know who the troublemakers are going to be, and this engenders things like focused deterrence policing and various kinds of hotspot policing, use of shot spotters as well, fusion centers. There's a whole infrastructure here. But there's a fight back happening. In Maine, it looks like they're going to defund their fusion center because they were working hand in hand with right-wing movements. They were engaged in civil and human rights abuses. They waste a tremendous amount of money doing nothing positive. And so, yes, we need to keep fighting on that front. I think we have to look to the groups that are doing this work every day: the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, the Stop Group in New York, and to some extent the Brennan Center, who I have a lot of beefs with, has a good surveillance shop that's kind of doing its own thing. So they're worthwhile partners.
Carrington?
I actually have two questions. One was surveillance related. Just if this book was written in 2017, I'm just wondering if there have been developments,
Well,
like
it was
maybe
written in 2016.
Okay, exactly.
Right.
So I wondered if there's anything like closer to home, like we should be concerned about as organizers and activists, in terms of surveillance. If there's something, any suggestions you can give us? I have a follow-up question as well.
Well, we never know for sure what dirty tricks the NYPD is up to, for instance. Whenever we see an uptick in mobilization, we should expect an uptick in political policing. So I'm sure they're keeping some files on people, and they're sitting around talking about how to how to respond to this threat. There was just a piece in ProPublica about the surveillance of journalists in Memphis. That's just an example that journalists who were covering movement people approvingly were being followed so that the police could figure out who they were talking to. So it's like every once in a while something will come out into the open. But we don't really know what they're doing, so we just have to be vigilant and constantly looking for any signs of what nonsense they're up to.
You had a second question?
Yeah, I did. And this one, I don't know if you can even touch it or if you know anything about it. Again, I'm on the international committee, but I'm curious about the deadly exchange program with Israel. You don't hear a lot about it. I don't understand it, how it's possible, and you know, how active it is at this time. Is this, and I can understand if you don't want to talk about it as well. So, but I'd like.
I've been quoted on this. If you
Okay.
Google me, I have a public position on this. I mean, I think it's a bad idea, but I don't think it's unique to Israel. There's a long history of exchanges between domestic policing and various bad foreign actors. School of Americas, that was where domestic police were involved in training essentially death squads in Latin America and vice versa. Stuart Schrader's excellent book, Badges Without Borders. Sitting here. Yeah, that was sitting here. Badges Without Borders. This really, it looks very closely at like the Vietnam era, but it's a little bit more recent, and he's very prolific and writes for Jacobin and other places, so you can look up his writings more broadly. But yes, there's always been this two-way exchange, and I appreciate the political motivation to highlight the abuses going on in the occupied territories, but this is only one piece of the puzzle. You know, that there's a lot of blame to go around.
Is that so? There are other exchanges besides with Israel that are going on currently, or are you speaking about things in the past?
There's all kinds of forms of this. So, for instance, NYPD has personnel stationed in like 5 different countries right now. Working now, they're supposed to be doing terrorism intelligence gathering, but of course that means that they're in touch with the political police in these other countries. They're constantly sharing ideas, and then that feeds back to how they do terror policing in New York. So you get bullshit like the demographics unit that's going around Arab coffee shops spying on people, because that's what they learned in Turkey. You know, so it's not just Israel. We have American police attached to UN projects. We have police are always on the move. They do consulting. They're involved in foreign policy. They're involved right now in Afghanistan and Iraq. So this is, so we don't always have a name for it. But yeah, it's a constant circulation of stuff. And the feds do some things and domestic police, but then they talk to each other and they're on these joint task forces. I mean, look at the DEA and their involvement in Latin America, where they're working with horrible abusive policing regimes. And then they take those ideas and they're part of a drug task force in Los Angeles to fight gangs. And they're like, well, we learned this from the secret police in Colombia. Why don't we try this? You know, so this stuff is happening all over the place.
We have about another 10 minutes to go before we want to wind down. But I'm going to inject myself one more time before I return to the stack. But you mentioned that the Fusion Center in Maine was working with some right-wing organizations. We're now seeing the Philly cops very buddy-buddy with the Proud Boys. How serious is this association of cops with neo-Nazi white supremacist organizations?
Well, I mean, it's real. LA County sheriffs, Portland police, you know, these things pop up constantly. So it's not a one-off. So we know that there are many police who are white supremacists, but not as many as there were 40 years ago. think the problem was much worse, and much worse during the civil rights era, especially in the South, but not uniquely in the South. But I don't think we can reduce the problems of race and policing to some cops who are white supremacists. Right? I mean, we know that racial differences of police aren't that predictive of police behavior, and that there are structural forces at work here. The decision to turn the problems of Black and brown communities over to the police to manage is at the root of this. And the race and racial animus of individual officers is kind of somewhat irrelevant to that.
I see DJs on the stack, but is there anybody who has not yet asked a question who would like to get in? Okay, DJ, what's yours?
Yeah, so you talked about this, I think a little bit before, but I would love to go even deeper into this. I mean, I think it's been shown, I think you talked about this, I know like Max Kennedy has written about this, that often the people who are most in favor of sort of more heavy-handed policing are the communities most affected by it. And so I wonder if you have more thoughts. I know you talked about like connecting with local organizations and stuff. Like,
I wouldn't say they're in favor of heavy-handed policing,
sure.
but they have come to rely on policing as a tool. So here's and people should look up, should take a look at Locking Up Our Own by James Foreman Jr. on this question. So these communities have very real problems. And they've been told for the last 40, 50 years, the only tool that government's going to give them to address these problems is police. And so over time, many of them have just adopted conservative ideologies. And there is a real issue of deeply conservative religiosity and moralization in these poor communities, which is really what we're talking about, white and Black and brown. So evangelicals and these kinds of things have adopted a kind of authoritarian, moralistic outlook. So that's an independent problem in some ways, not totally independent because that's tied to macro political economic dynamics, but more broad. But that's not majoritarian. What makes it a more powerful majoritarian issue, and this is the reason we lost at the city council on a bigger victory, is because people are being told their choice is policing or nothing. And given that there are people getting shot, they will choose police. So that's why I said before, our task now is not to make the abstract argument, it's to go into communities and convince people in our neighborhoods that we have a better solution for keeping them safe. Just need the investments and the opportunity to get it going.
I don't see anyone on stack, so let me ask you this. It's been 4 years since you wrote the book, 3 years since it was published. Things have changed on police politics. What are you working on now? What are you looking to do?
So we're going to do a second edition of the book, and I'll do a little updating and maybe talk a little bit more directly about violence as a strategic question. How do we respond to violence? I mean, I am overwhelmed with requests to support organizing. So I'm doing multiple events like this every day, sometimes as many as 5 a day. So, and I intend to keep doing that as long as I can keep it up, especially when it's groups doing organizing. I like to do the book clubs too, but obviously this is a book club for a political organization that's doing organizing. So for me, this is ideal. And so that's the immediate thing. I mean, the Policing and Social Justice Project that I coordinate, we are also actively involved every day on the issue of gang policing in New York City. We're writing reports, we're doing organizing, we're working with council members, we're meeting with DA candidates. So I have staff that works on that every day. And I'm involved in supervising and helping to coordinate that work. And then at the national level, I'm supporting these budget fights and broader organizing all across the country. So, before COVID, I was in a different city every other week for 3 years working with folks. And I intend to keep doing that remotely until I can start traveling again.
Whatever that may be.
Yeah.
All right, Karen.
I miss the travel because it's not, you can give a talk like this, and obviously I'm doing as much of that as I can, but there's no substitute for the hanging around and the unanticipated encounters and the informal networking and the having drinks with people after the talk. A lot happens in those settings. That's true for academic events too. I miss that informal networking. It's really important because we're organizers, and that's part of how organizing happens. So.
Yeah, it's funny when people talk about, the post-COVID world as being more Zoom-centered. All that's going to get lost. All this face-to-face serendipity is going to get lost. There'd be a very, very severe loss. Karen had a question.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering if you could speak a little to, we do think about like budget stuff, like city council positions that we could organize towards, but like on a political level in terms of like electoral politics, like as organizers, like I was on a call for like Queens DSA's electoral strategy yesterday. Is there anything you suggest that we might be overlooking or anything else we could look into that we could organize around besides city council members and their effect on the budget to kind of work towards abolition and other things like that?
Well, I mean, there is a state and federal level in terms of like government. So, I mean, I think people need to look at this BREATHE Act that I put in the chat. It's pretty amazing in laying out an alternative to this nonsense from the Pelosi and the Congressional Black Caucus that came out. Not to mention, obviously, what the Senate Republicans and Trump put out. I mean, the irony is that Trump's program was better than the Congressional Black Caucus program in some ways. And I think it's because Van Jones was rising. I mean, it was still terrible, but it actually had some more concrete things than what the Democrats had. Anyway, so I just think the more we can do to go into communities and talk to people about alternatives to public safety, whether or not it has anything to do with an election, is crucial right now. I mean, it could include pilot projects. It could include mutual aid undertakings. It could include things like pod mapping. For those who don't know, this is when people come in and you talk to them about the resources that they might be able to mobilize instead of calling the police in a variety of very concrete situations. And working with them, like maybe identifying, well, what resource are you lacking? How could we get that in place while we work on the budget thing, while we work on these bigger transformations? Because that process is about killing the cop in your head, right? This idea that the cops are automatically the solution to every problem. That's part of what we need to do to build this movement. So I agree, it can't just be about candidates, it can't just be about lobbying, it's got to be about building community power.
All right, we're just about out of time, but here's a question from Michael. What else do you recommend that people read to learn more about this?
Well, I recommended a few things in the conversation. There's an article in New York Magazine that I was a part of about books about the history of policing that is good if you're interested in that angle of it. There is a book that's edited by Egeris, E-G-A-E-R-I-S Dixon, about transformative justice beyond safety. I never remember the exact title. But if you just look up that she has such an unusual first name. She's from Brooklyn. She's in Brooklyn. She was part of the Audre Lorde project and was involved in exactly these things like pod mapping and developing alternative community safety mechanisms. And the book is an edited volume of people around the country doing this work, like Miriam Kava is part of the book, talking about what would this really look like at the community level. So I think that's exciting. I mentioned Lee Goodmark's book on decriminalizing domestic violence. Revolting Prostitutes is an amazing book about sex work and the need to get cops out of the sex work business. So, and there are a bunch of suggested readings at the end of my book.
right, we wanted to add this.
I'll just say also, sorry, I have a YouTube channel, and there's about a dozen interviews on there, including with Jairus about her book, of recent books that I think are just fantastic.
All right, we wanted to end this at 55, but Justin hopped on the stack. How do we feel about running a little longer?
I'd like to hear from Justin. Justin and I talk from time to time.
Oh, consensus, okay with that? All right, Justin.
I'm gonna be quick, I promise. This is more of like a announcement / question, but so we have our racial justice working group, which has the Defund NYPD campaign as going to be basically the working group's priority for the next year. And everybody, if you want to get involved in that, I can drop, Jeremy just dropped the link.
Democracy Now! I need Goodman.
Sorry.
The link's in the chat. I'm going to also drop a link to a bit.ly where you can sign up for one of our committees working on the campaign. There's a variety of them, but I guess what I wanted to ask was, like, if you have any insight on like what you think would be most useful for us to be investing time and resources in for this campaign for the next budget fight.
So I think you got to look where the organizing is happening, right? It's not, as we've discussed, we shouldn't reinvent the wheel, and also we shouldn't think we can just solve these things as DSA. So we got to look where the budget. We got to look to groups like Vocal New York. We got to look at what's happening with the sex work and crim movement. We got to look at what's happening with the mental health police alternatives to policing stuff. What's happening on the homelessness front? What's happening with the Drug Policy Alliance and their work? So it's about identifying groups that have a good analysis, that are doing work in the neighborhoods. The Rockaway Youth Task Force, I think, is a great group that's trying to get cops out of the schools, and is organizing young people in schools. And so I always look to them and see, what are they up to? Make the road, the group is perfect, there's room for critique, whatever, but we look to these folks to see what they're prioritizing, what they're engaged in mobilizing people around, and we try and figure out how we can play a productive role supporting that and bringing that to other communities where we have a stronger base, maybe. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Alex. Thanks for doing this, and thanks for doing the work too. It's very important stuff. And I think Jeremy's going to handle the wrap up.
Yeah, thank you so much. On behalf of all of us, thanks again to Danielle and to Carrington and to Doug for all your work today. I'm just briefly saying a little bit about getting involved in DSA. Justin said how to get involved in our defund campaign. Generally, anyone who's new, highly encourage signing up and becoming a member. I'm putting the link there. We've got to organize together. The more there are of us organizing together, the more power we have and the more change we can make. I also, on behalf of North Brooklyn Political Education, have a few quick, exciting announcements. There is a talk coming up by Doug Henwood, who you heard from today. I'm going to plop the link for that in the chat on the economics of the pandemic and COVID-19, kind of where the economy is going and what that means for our organizing. That's on July the 27th, Monday, July the 27th. So please sign up to get the Zoom link for that. And our night school, our North Brooklyn night school, which is excellent, especially for new people, is starting up again on September the 14th, which is going to feature Nathan Robinson for its first section on why you should be a socialist. So mark your calendars, September 14th, Monday. It's every other Monday night after that for much of the year. So, and all are welcome. And last but not least, for new people, we have a new members event. North Brooklyn has a new members event on Thursday. I'm plopping the link for that. And it's not just for people who are already members. It's also for anyone who's interested in socialist politics, in DSA. So please reach out, people you know who voted for Julia Salazar who want to get more involved, reach out. We're designing it to be very friendly and a place where people can hook into campaign work and get started. So thank you so much.
I have one thing. Jeremy, is it Wednesday or Thursday? And could you post the link? You did not post the link.
Which one?
I think it's, I'm sorry, I think it was Wednesday that we're having the new, the MBK new member orientation.
I thought it's Thursday, but I'd be wrong. Let me just look at that.
Oh, it's there.
Yeah, it's Thursday, July the 16th.
Oh, I see it. I didn't see the thing. Oh, it is Thursday. Okay, I got the date wrong. Thanks.
It's okay. Yeah, people who voted for Julia Salazar, people who came to protests, your family and friends, anyone and everyone is welcome. So who's closing us out? Carrington, go.
I can do it. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. It was a great talk. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. We're so happy to have you among us as a member. And I know I, for one, got so much out of the book. I can see everyone here on the call did as well. Looking forward to continue to organize with you all, and we'll see you next time. Solidarity.
Bye, everyone.